Mike's on Mike is made possible by contributions from listeners like you to the Jacksonville History Center. One city, many stories. Online at jackshistory.org.
Mike's on Mike, a conversation about politics, government, and Jacksonville. With 50-year opinion leaders Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and award-winning broadcaster and longtime political observer, Mike Miller.
Welcome to another episode of Mike's on Mike. I'm Mike Miller, and Mr. Tolbert's at his remote studio, and Mr. Hightower happens to be in Ukraine with an international medical group, and he's taking much-needed triage medical equipment to the people who are suffering from the war in Ukraine. We congratulate Mike. We wish him safety in his trip and a very safe trip home as well. We're glad to have him with us, too. That's the most important thing as well. Well, there's no doubt that today many believe the media, especially the broadcast media, is under assault. This is also true of public broadcasting, which in Jacksonville is led, of course, by WJCT. Today, our guest is David McGowan, who's the president and CEO of WJCT. David's in his prime seat to know what's been going on there and what the future holds for public broadcasting. He became the CEO of WJCT in 2017. Boy, it doesn't seem like it's been 8 years, I can tell you. Succeeding our friend Michael Boylan, who, of course, now is a city council member, and running the public broadcasting operation now for 18 years. Before landing in Jacksonville, David worked in private media and digital companies, and he spent the last 7 years as head of the news and public affairs for WETA in Washington, D.C.'s public media station. I'm sure you were happy to get out of there, at least the city. Welcome to Mike's on Mike. It's nice to have you with us, David. Thank you. Mr. Talbert, kick it off for us, please.
Yeah, David, thanks so much for joining us. All three of us have a history with WJCT that we won't get into today, but it's long and it's been very valuable to the three of us. I'm not sure how important it has ever been to Channel 7, but anyhow, before we get into public television and WJCT, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to Jacksonville. How did you get here?
Sure. Well, as one of your mics mentioned just a minute ago, I worked in public media a long time ago, actually, in Washington. I worked at WETA, and I was the head of news and public affairs programming there. That WETA is the largest provider of news and public affairs programming to the public television system. And then I went off and worked in Europe and managed some mostly cable companies for private equity investors, did something very, very different than public media. And short version of the story is my kids started coming back to the U.S. for college. That was when I was working in Europe. I was living in London, but working in Germany and Switzerland and Budapest, Hungary. And when my kids decided to come back, my wife and I said, we got to come back. We can't be across the ocean from our kids. So that led me, when we sold the company that I worked for last as CEO, which was a company called Invitel in Hungary. You have those moments in life where you get to think, what do I really want to do? And what I really wanted to do was to use the skills that I had learned in the private sector to make a local media organization that operated in the public interest really strong and sustainable. And that led me to get in touch with the folks at WJCT, who at that stage, as you mentioned, were looking for a successor to my predecessor, Michael Boylan. I had never been to Jacksonville before coming to talk to the board. So it was a little bit of a roll of the dice for both sides, and here we are.
Take us back to 2017, David. What did you walk into at Channel 7? What was it like back then?
Well, WJCT has been around for a long time, right? We've been in the community first as Channel 7 as a single television station. That's how we were founded more than 60 years ago. So we were founded as a community asset, really a community public interest organization, really only operating in television back in the late 50s. We added radio to our set of services about 10 years after that. And for the decades that followed, we had mainly been a television and radio organization. I mean, that's what we did. That's what we knew how to do. We broadcast on towers. We were PBS and NPR members, and we understood how to do that. I think what we understood less well how to do in 2017 was to operate in the media environment that we find ourselves today. And of course, it has changed every year, even between 2017 and now. But certainly the world was changing quickly in the 2010s, if you will. And I think WJCT is not alone in that. We were many public media organizations, indeed, I think many nonprofit organizations find themselves challenged to adapt to the pace of change that happens in the business world, particularly in the media and technology world that we're a part of. So I think it was an organization that had served the community very, very well over a long period of time, had done a number of really important and good things, and we continue to do most, if not all of those things. But it also really needed to accelerate its adaptation, if you will, to the world that we find ourselves in today. And so that's really what we set about to do.
Let me just jump in for a moment here before Mr. Hightower comes in, but tell us what happened in the teens, if you will, that made
the teens,
disruptive.
and we all, I like to say that everyone means something a little bit different when they use that word digital. But I mean, the way we all consume our media really, the change really accelerated then. It didn't begin then. It really probably began in earnest first with the web and then with the iPhone in 2007. But during that decade, right, that followed the introduction of the iPhone, which was 2007 to 2017, right, when I arrived, was the time when, and I'm looking at people even around this room, right, scrolling on their phones,
right.
Getting the news that way, getting their entertainment that way, getting their television right through Netflix or whatever streaming service they favor. So it's just a million little changes that have added up to a gigantic change in the way that we all interact with media every single day.
Yeah, David, welcome. Appreciate it. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
As someone who's been a long fan, supporter of Channel 7, I used to work the phones way back then, even during the auctions. You've been there since 17. What makes WJCT unique in the Jacksonville media market?
Well, I think what makes us unique, and I will say I think what makes us unique is becoming more and more evident with every passing day. But what makes us unique is a couple of things. First of all, we are owned by this community. We are an independent 501c3 organization. We have no higher authority that our Board of Trustees answer to. I report to our Board of Trustees. Our Board of Trustees is composed of all local people, all elected to serve as volunteers, as the overseers of this incredible community asset, which has among its assets television broadcasting licenses and radio broadcasting licenses, but a whole range of other assets and capabilities as well. And I think the fact that we are locally controlled entirely is a really important distinction versus whether you look at our local television stations, which are all owned by broadcasting groups and conglomerates, or even our local newspaper, the Florida Times-Union, which of course is now a Gannett property. They are subject to decisions made elsewhere, and we are not. That's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that we have no interest other than the public interest. We have no shareholders. We have no corporate overseers. We have nothing guiding our work other than how can we best meet the information, education, and high-quality access to arts and entertainment needs of this community. That's what we're there for. That's what we do. And if you look at some of the contrasts we've seen now in, organizations like ABC, which is owned by Disney, making decisions about whether
Jimmy
people
Kimmel?
should be on, who should be on the air and who should be off the air, right? Based on a whole range of reasons. And I won't get into, the speculation around that, but those are shareholder interests, right, that are being represented. We don't have that. We only have the public interest.
Right. I have a follow-up on David, because you used the word digital. How is public media and WJCT adapting to that large group of people in, quote, the digital first audience? You kind of mentioned that earlier. How is it going?
I'd say it's going pretty well. We're actually heavily invested in that work, and I'm only going to mention a couple of examples because we could go on and on about that. But I think one thing to note is that the way that people interact with the programs that we distribute nationally and the programs that we produce and distribute locally is now across a wide range of platforms. I mean, we operate something like between 7 and 10 different platforms that give people access to our programming. So if I look at a program like First Coast Connect, for example, which you may be familiar with, it's kind of our flagship public affairs program, which is a WJCT News 89.9 program. It's fundamentally a radio program. But it actually only gets about 60% of its audience through people who listen to it on the radio in the morning. People get it, the live video stream on YouTube, or they might get it on Facebook, or they might listen to the program as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, or they might listen through our app, or they might listen streaming on the website, on their desktop, or, on their phone. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, right? And so we know that audience is splintered, and we have to serve them in whatever place they might be, because our job fundamentally is to connect that information to those people. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing that we've done is to lean into the creation of some local programs and services which really are only delivered digitally. The most prominent of those, I would say today, is a service that we launched in 2021 called Jacksonville Today. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that service, but it's essentially a digital-first local news service. That service doesn't exist on the air anywhere. It is delivered both through a daily morning newsletter and on the web. And that service now has over 50,000 daily subscribers, right? Daily readers. So if you look at that audience, right, compared to our radio, it's still not as big as our radio audience overall, but it is fast approaching the size of our radio audience, right? And so we have built those services, again, in recognition of the ways that people get their news and information. Now, the challenge we have associated with that, or one of the challenges that we have associated with that, is that the business model is different in those different media. And, we operated for decades with a business model that people pretty well understood, right? We broadcast television, we broadcast radio. Every so often we go on the air to everyone's great annoyance and ask people, right, to contribute money so that right?
For you and others.
We ask people to contribute money so we can continue to make these services available free of charge to everyone. And that business model worked very well among a certain generation of people, and it worked very well in that broadcast medium where you kind of had no choice but to distribute it free through over-the-air broadcasting. But one of our great challenges, and indeed our whole industry's great challenge, is to transition our business model into these digital environments, in addition to just making services available. Because making services available without figuring out the business model is a way to ruin. And I'm not interested in that, and neither is anyone who supports us.
I'm one of those subscribers to Jacksonville Today, and that's one of the first things I do every morning is read what's there. And this particular morning, and I want to congratulate your people, this particular morning, you had a story about the school board's decision or non-decision on where it's going to relocate and why. And I thought that was very insightful. You opened a can of worms, I think, which we're all glad to see because we want to know more. And I appreciate that very, very much.
Well, I thank you very much for saying that, and I'm going to put on a quick plug for if you are not a subscriber. If you're listening today and you are not a subscriber to Jacksonville Today, it's jackstoday.org. It takes about 2 minutes to sign up, and it's free.
We'll get that up on the show, too,
Right.
so that people will be able to do that. All right, good. Excuse me. Sorry about that.
It's you, Mr. Miller.
I know. It was somebody from Channel 4 saying, why aren't we on? But nevertheless, let's dive a little deeper into the business model issue, because that's one of the things that hit everybody's headlines, not just
Right.
yours, of course. And that is the current administration trying to eliminate funding for the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. What's WJCT's relationship with them, and how serious are these threats going to be?
Well, the threats, you say trying, it's a done deal now. That money has been rescinded. And I should point out for a minute what rescinded actually means. Rescinded means that money that has already been appropriated, so money that was appropriated by Congress and signed by the president was taken back, taken away, essentially. Now, it was a fully legal process. Rescission is a process that is outlined in the law, and it was followed, and Congress actually voted to rescind it after all. But that represents the complete elimination of all federal funding for public media across the country. In addition, in the state of Florida, we were hit by the governor deciding at the very last minute to line item veto out what are called the community service grants for all public media organizations. That's public television stations, public radio stations across the state. What that means for WJCT very specifically is the immediate loss of nearly $2 million in funding from our bottom line. I mean, we are, again, let's use round numbers just to make things simple. If you think of we're nearly a $10 million revenue organization, you take away $2 million, it's 20%,
yeah,
right?
that's
It's a
a lot of money.
20% reduction without any warning. And so that has an impact. There's no question. You can't get away from that. And that's what it means. We all, as public media organizations, we received that funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the federal funding. And indeed, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has recently announced that it's simply going to just fold up shop and go away because it has really no funds to operate anymore. Its main purpose was as a regranting agency to the hundreds of public television and public radio licensees across the country. And, stations are affected differently due to the size of their budget and the relative percentage of their budget that those monies, were. So I would say we're kind of right in the middle. There are stations, particularly small stations in a lot of rural communities. You've probably seen some of the press around that in places like Alaska and so forth, where these public radio stations are real lifelines. They're the only media, certainly the only local media that exist in those places. And so they were dependent for, maybe 50% of their budgets. And a lot of them will fold because they can't continue to operate on that basis. There are stations in larger markets that are less impacted than we were. So we're kind of in the middle.
Okay, tell us then how you're going to be able to respond to that 20% cut in your budget. What might we not be able to hear or see as a result of this?
Well, one of the things that's happened over the last couple of months since the rescission was passed and the state money went away is that we have negotiated pretty hard, I would say, with almost all of our vendors, but in particular our vendors for programming. So on the radio, for example, people may or may not be aware that we get programs not only from NPR, but also from other organizations that provide programming to public radio stations. And so we have negotiated with all of them, and we have negotiated with PBS and with other television providers. And we've been able to reduce all of those fees pretty substantially for this next year, because everyone is trying to figure out what the future looks like. There will also be some reductions in other expenses across the organization and some personnel expenses and other things that you might expect. And that is just the reality of what we need to do in order to cope with that kind of immediate reduction. We have been fortunate over the last several years to been able to substantially grow our revenue. And so we do have, some runway, some window of time in which to address kind of the imbalance between our expense base and our revenue base. But it does need to be done, and it will probably result in some changes over time, not only to WJCT, but across the country to what PBS offers. I mean, one of the things that's happened is that education programming, for example, a program called Ready to Learn, which was funded, has also been eliminated. And so what does that mean? I mean, in media, especially the kind of media we do, a lot of these changes take a little bit of time because we will still very proudly present Ken Burns' program on the American Revolution this fall on PBS because that was funded about 10 years ago, right? So these things take time. The impact will take time to show up, but it will show up.
One thing, if I can follow up, one thing that I recall from my years in broadcasting, and particularly AM stations that were starting to lose the luster as FM was taking over, was that they ended up brokering their stations quite a bit. They asked the doctor, they asked the lawyer, they asked the money manager, and those principals actually paid the stations for those hours that they were on the air because they profited from it. And here's my phone number, call me off the air if you want to get together. Does WJCT do that kind of brokering, or is that something that you've looked at doing as a revenue generator?
We do not do it, and actually we're prohibited from doing it. But I wouldn't do it even if we were allowed to do it. And the reason is that, again, we operate in the public interest, and that means being completely transparent about the fact that our programming is there to serve the public, and it's not there as an advertorial. It's not there to serve the interests of someone who has bought the time and is promoting a service, even though that may be kind of not very apparent to the listener or to the viewer. It's just not what we do. I have no objection to it, and we do that. Not that kind of work, but we do kind of similar to what I call kind of advertorial work in some other arenas that are not over the air. But we fundamentally operate with the principle that everyone who consumes anything that we distribute needs to understand whose interest it's being produced in and who the funders of it are. And so that kind of time for sale is not something that we do.
Yeah, David, we live in a pretty conservative area where I think a lot of people don't understand or really don't think WJCT or public television should receive any kind of federal support, federal funds. What do you say to these people?
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, one thing is that I understand that view. I understand the reputation, certainly, that NPR has. I think in my mind, until really the last 9 months or so, I would say there was a big difference in the way that PBS and NPR were perceived. I mean, PBS has been the most trusted media brand in the United States for many, many years running. If you look at the NewsHour, for example, the PBS NewsHour, its most noted news product, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that program had any bias in it or that it didn't vigorously pursue both sides of every question. And I think NPR also does its level best, but I will also freely admit that it doesn't enjoy that reputation. And it has on occasion, I think, made some mistakes, some of which it's admitted to and some of which, when I raised them, maybe they haven't admitted to yet. But be that as it may, I think what's important to understand is that these really fundamentally, both NPR and PBS, are organizations that also operate in the public interest. And whatever mistakes of omission or mischaracterization or what have you they may have made are not done because of an intention to promote a specific ideology or a particular kind of point of view. They really aren't. And I've spent a lot of time with NPR editors and so forth. So again, we all have our complaints, I think, and I understand that. But I will also say that, for example, around the service Jacksonville Today, we made a very specific decision when we launched that service, and that was to not launch it with the same brand that WJCT is operated under. And we did that for a number of reasons, but one of them was because if we were launching a new local-only service, we are completely devoted to being nonpartisan, and we wanted to kind of establish our bona fides on that, if you will, with a clean slate, because we know that there are people who look at WJCT News or NPR in particular and say, yeah, that may not be for me. And we needed, I think, to operate on a broader basis than that. And that's why we did that.
David, you've sort of done when we talk about Jacksonville. We also, though, live in a community that often circles the wagons when someone or something important to us is under threat or needs support. What kind of response or support are you seeing or feeling or hearing from the community, especially to your listeners and viewers, given this 20% cut?
Terrific. I would say the response has been very good, very strong. I don't know that we really had expectations because no one had any idea what to expect, but it has probably exceeded our expectations. And I'll give you an example of that. So when I arrived, we had about 9,000 people in this region who contributed to WJCT, who were current contributors, the way we define current contributors to WJCT. We had grown that number over the years, and as we approached the summer, we were at about 14,000, right? And so that's a pretty good amount of growth, right? But in the last 3 months, we have seen that number now grow to over 16,000, right?
How long? How many?
Over 16,000. So another 2,000 people, right, who have not contributed, were not previously contributors, have come in and said, I'm going to contribute. And many, many more have said, okay, if I was giving $5 a month, actually, I'm going to give 10. Because they recognize how valuable the service is. And I think it's very, very humbling and gratifying to see people recognize the institution and the organization and its value to the community, and to say, I really want to make sure that this endures. So that has been very important, and it's one of the reasons that you're going to see, this fall and on through we're an October 1st fiscal year organization, on through the next fiscal year. I think what you will see and hear on the air and on these other platforms that we operate is going to be very similar. There will be a few changes, but it will be very similar to the services we have operated in the recent past. Again, that's not to say that there isn't some structural change that is going to be required in the public media system, if you will, across the country. I believe it will be necessary and it will happen. But that stability is really important as a platform to negotiate these changes. And that stability has really been made possible by the reaction of the community.
I know this is going to be...
If I could just
sure, go ahead.
Editorial comment, gentlemen. I think that, David, goes back to the reputation and the brand of Channel 7. No question. All three of us, Mikes, as Mike Tolbert said, we grew up with it. And so there's a brand and a reputation. And I think that speaks of Channel 7, but I think it speaks a lot of our community.
Let me ask this, and it may be a tough question for you, David, but I'd like to get your at least immediate response on it. You've been here for 8 years. Tell me what WJCT is going to look like in 8 years from now if, and we all know, and let me preface this by saying we all know that in politics, administrations change and so do priorities. So we don't know if this cutback in funding is something that will be long-term or short-term. But let's just say that it is long-term. Tell me what you envision WJCT and 89.9 to look like in 8 years from now.
Well, first of all, I think it's really important that WJCT as an organization maintain the ability to invest in the future. We cannot be an organization that says, oh, well, it's been a lot of change from 2010 to 2025, but we're just going to now stop.
Right.
Right? We can't do that. We need to continue to evolve our offerings in a lot of different ways, and that requires investment. So hunkering down is a good strategy for a little while, perhaps, but it is not an enduring way to. It's not a business model. It's not a way to make sure that WJCT of the future is the same one that created its reputation in the first place.
Right.
So I want to say that at the outset. The second thing I will say is that the most important source of revenue for WJCT is individual contributors. That has been true for some time. It is especially true now. If we were to look at how to make up for the loss of public sector revenue, if you will, right, from the federal government and from the state, it would require us more or less to nearly double the amount of funds that we receive from individual contributors in this community. And I mean, you can tell me whether you think that's possible or not. I think, personally, based on the growth that we have been able to achieve over the last 7 or 8 years, and the ways that we've been able to achieve that growth. In other words, it's not just, going on the air for, let's go on the air for 4 weeks instead of, right, and ask for money. It's by offering new services in new places that people actually care about. Right. If we look at Jacksonville today as an example of that, right, more than 1,500 people today are current contributors to Jacksonville Today, not to any other thing. Right? They may not even know that they're giving to WJCT. They come and they support Jacksonville Today. And the same can be said of some of the other services that we offer. And so we are going to need to accelerate our growth in sort of, I hate to put it in these sort of business terms, but in this consumer-facing business, right, that encourages people to contribute and to make services broadly available, these kinds of services broadly available to our community. I think it's doable. I think the last 3 months have given me, some level of confidence. It's not going to happen overnight. We know that, but that's what's required, and that's what we're going to pursue. We're also going to pursue every single option you can think of, right? So what does WJCT look like in 8 years? Honestly,
who knows, right?
Who knows? I couldn't give you a
we don't know
good
what
answer to
broadcasting
that
is going to look
because
like
I don't exactly, and I don't. At that point, maybe PBS is a streaming only service, right? We offer a PBS video app, our own version of Netflix. We have Passport, right? Maybe broadcasting isn't a good business anymore. I don't know. It's hard to predict those things. What I do know is that we need to be in a position to be nimble, to have the ability to move at the speed of the industries that we operate in, and to have the talent in the organization to successfully navigate that change. And that requires resources. And my job, right, is to make sure that we have the resources necessary to do just that.
My introduction to Channel 7 was in the 70s when it was housed in an old automobile dealership on Main Street in Springfield. So I've been there a long time. I was around when it was decided to build on the river. I even had an office in Channel 7 over there where you are now at one point back in the 80s. So I'm very familiar with that. That area that you're in has changed a great deal over the last several years, and it's going to continue to evolve. You've got the Jaguars and Shad Khan building and want to build more. You've got Metropolitan Park being revitalized. Is there any thought or consideration or pressure on Channel 7 to sell that property and move to another location off the river?
So it's an interesting idea that does come up. There are certain members of the city council I know who are very interested in seeing if that land, which is city-owned land, by the way. It's just so to be clear, it's a state-owned building.
Right.
The state built the building for us on city-owned land, and we have a long-term lease on that property. And so, sure, there's a question that the city, I think, would naturally raise: is, look, can we get that land on the tax rolls, right? And put it in private hands. And I certainly understand that motivation. What I'd say, though, in response is that WJCT physically in that place is a very dynamic presence. We offer more than 100 live events in that space. We have just launched a movie series, films at WJCT Studios. We're going to offer more than 25 public screenings in that space next year. And we have invested a lot in the capabilities of that space to be a movie theater or a home for all kinds of venues. We recently hosted a theater company who put on a production in one of our spaces. We had an event last Friday night with one of our music programs, with which actually 2 city council members happened to show up at and come to. I think what we would like is for all of the stakeholders in Jacksonville, and indeed in that specific neighborhood, to look at WJCT and say, how can we maximize the value of what WJCT offers to the community in this space? Because you know what? People who stay at the Four Seasons want to go to public events too. And we're walking distance, right? We're going to be walking distance through what is hopefully in some years, going to be a beautifully replenished Met Park. Stadium of the Future is right across the street, and we offer lots of services associated with that stadium. The Georgia Bulldog Club, it will not be received well by Gators fans, but the Georgia Bulldog fan occupies our building for nearly an entire week around Florida, Georgia, right? We offer parking. There's just so many things that our organization does in that space physically. And one of the things that's happening now, as a result of the new Marine Fire Station being built adjacent to our property, is that our entire outdoor space is kind of being reworked, repaved, reworked, and a whole bunch of new signage will be apparent at the end of that process. And some of that will indeed be along the lines of presenting WJCT's entertainment offerings. I mean, it is the sports and entertainment district, right? Mm-hmm. And the only real entertainment there is the occasional concert at Daly's place. Well, if you come by our place 4 times a week, there's something going on there in the evening. So I think we bring a lot of vitality to the neighborhood, and I understand there are a lot of different perspectives on this, but I'd like to get people thinking more along those lines.
Okay, we've got to wrap things up here.
Great answer.
It is a wrap, as they say in the business. One more time, David, please tell people who are listening to our show rather than watching it how they can best contribute to WJCT and what they need to do.
Absolutely. It's super easy. WJCT.org, WJCT.org. There's a donate button right on top. You can learn all about everything that we offer there, including the movie series that I mentioned. All the events are there under the events tab, or jaxtoday.org is another great place to go.
Very good. Thank you so very much. It's great meeting you.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Here. We thank you very, very much. And that's going to do it for
David.
another episode of Mike's on Mike. Our friend, Mr. Hightower, is going to be in Ukraine next week as well, so we'll get to see more of him then. And meanwhile, we appreciate you being with us. Once again, we also want to thank our fine sponsor, the Jacksonville History Center, Dr. Alan Bliss and his great staff, and of course, the very generous contributors who keep the lights on and the cameras rolling. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you all again next week.
Hi, I'm Scott Westerman, and I produce Mike's on Mike, with a special thank you to listeners like you who support the program through your contributions to the Jacksonville History Center. 2 years ago, Dr. Alan Bliss and his team generously agreed to aggregate gifts from listeners like you to help pay for the production and distribution of Mike's on Mike. When you specify Mike's on Mike with your donation to the History Center, your support makes these programs possible. and you're engaging in a relationship with the premier organization that celebrates the rich history of our hometown. If you enjoy these weekly conversations, consider a contribution to the Jacksonville History Center at jaxhistory.org. Say it's for Mike's on Mike. And if you're already a Mike's on Mike supporter, thank you.
Mike's on Mike with Mike Tolbert, Mike Hightower, and Mike Miller can be found on your favorite podcasting platform, Facebook, and YouTube. Visit the website at mikesonmike.com. Join us next time for more conversation with Mike's on Mike.
Mike.